introducing myself, and then I will introduce our speakers and guests. My name is Mateusz Strużyński, and I'm director of the Institute of Classical Philology at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. I'm also a founding editor of the online journal Antigone, and also in that capacity, I'm leading this conversation today. And the conversation is streamed and will be then available on the YouTube channel of the Faculty of Polish Classical Philology of Adam Mickiewicz University. And my guests today are two historians of antiquity, two classicists, Professor Marek Węcowski and Professor Edmund Stewart, and I will briefly introduce them. So Professor Marek Węcowski received his PhD degree at École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and then his habilitation degree from the University of Warsaw in Poland, and he is currently a professor at the University of Warsaw. He's been a visiting scholar on a number of universities, like University of Salzburg, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, Utrecht University. He also published many journals on the subject of ancient history and two books. The first one is The Rise of the Greek Aristocratic Banquet, published by Oxford University Press in 2014, and the second more recent book is Athenian Ostracism and Its Original Purpose, A Prisoner's Dilemma, also published by the Oxford University Press in 2022. And my other guest, is Professor Edmund Stewart, who received his PhD degree from the University of Nottingham, and he is currently a professor at the same University of Nottingham. And his book, published also by the Oxford University Press in 2017, is entitled Greek Tragedy on the Move, The Birth of a Pan-Hellenic Art Form. And there is also a second book coming also currently in press at the Oxford University Press, Skilled Labor and Professionalism in Classical Athens, as History of Techne. But Professor Stewart also published a number of articles on the subject of tyranny in ancient political thought and practice. And this is our subject today. So the relationship between ancient historiography, in particular Thucydides, political theory or political philosophy, if you will, and more specifically, the possible relationship or connection between Thucydides and our understanding of the current international situation, war in particular. And the inspiration for this conversation was a fact that both Marek Węcowski and Edmund Stewart published articles on this subject in Antigone. And I should also add that Edmund Stewart is also a founding editor of Antigone, and he published an article entitled Thucydides' Trap: Are the USA and China Today's Athens and Sparta? And more recently, Marek Węcowski published a piece, War, Imperialism and Democracy, Thucydides' Ukrainian War. So I wanted to talk to you today about, I don't want to use the word relevance because it's not the best word to use, I think, in that context. But I want to talk about the way our study of Thucydides from the point of view of classics or ancient history, how that can help us understand what is currently going on in the world, especially, I mean here, the war in Ukraine, but also, of course, there is war in Gaza going on, and a great tension, international tension. And Thucydides himself, I want to begin with a point which was made in a way by both of you, namely that Thucydides himself, in his history, claims that understanding the past enables us to understand the present and also to forecast the future. So Thucydides himself, in a way, invites us to treat history as something which can help us understand what is going on and what can happen in the future. But Marek Węcowski wrote in his piece, and I will quote here: Thucydides may be a poor guide to the history of our times. So the question is, how far can we go in drawing parallels between what Thucydides writes about and our current situation? To what extent we can use Thucydides' history in particular to understand what is going on? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Marek, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you so much for this invitation, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here with you. And I'm in as a discussion should possibly entail some kind of disagreement. I'm in a rather difficult situation because I couldn't agree more with Edmund's piece in Antigone a while ago. But returning to your question, I think that the main problem here is whether we think of Thucydides as a store of potential or any other Greek author or any other ancient and non-ancient historian as a store of historical analogies, or we try to understand deeper what was his true intentions when mentioning the utility of his work for future practitioners of politics in a way. And I think that the problem is that the second dimension of his work is rather about human nature in general than particular historical events. And so hence the astonishingly unjust treatment of the historians such as Thucydides and Herodotus by Aristotle in his Poetics, when he says that history is less philosophical than the drama. Whereas this is exactly what was the intention, I think, of Thucydides, to give us some insights into human nature based on empirically conceived historical, say, constellations. So when we take this latter point as our guide, as our guiding principle, then of course it's a rather general reflection on societies and not historical events. But if we rely on historical analogies as constructed artfully, events as constructed, processes as constructed artfully by Thucydides, then of course we fall into all those traps that Edward pointed out in our thinking about possible application of all this to our times, which I think is less important, but it is important because we have it in our minds, and because we do think in Thucydidean terms as classicists and ancient historians about the world around us, then the limitations of this kind of thinking, exactly what Edward did is in his paper, is perhaps the most important thing to have in mind. Now, I do not think that Thucydides is a good guide for the history of our times, if we do not delve deeper into his thinking about human nature, and especially about societies and their reactions to great historical upheavals. To just give you the one example, I myself, as many other colleagues in our field, wrote a paper just at the beginning, at the outset of the pandemics of coronavirus. Many papers published in worldwide in Haaretz by Irad Malkin and many others in Germany, Britain, and the United States, trying to analyze what was going to happen based on Thucydides. And I think we all failed because relying on Thucydides as a guide to the, say, disintegration of societies and social moralities did not meet the actual circumstances, did not fit into the actual circumstances and of our times, where more organized societies and even leaving aside the technological part of the problem, actually did not disintegrate the way everyone expected. So here are the limitations of what we may or may not try to do with Thucydides in our hands. So maybe I will stop here, and then probably we can go further in this discussion.
Edmund, feel free to respond, of course.
Yes, thank you. I'm also, I think, more or less in agreement, although I would put it slightly differently. I like this. I mean, I agree totally that Thucydides is not necessarily, strictly speaking, a guide for our times. But then again, I would somewhat slightly paraphrase Thucydides, if you will let me, and say that he should be a guide for all time. His work is a katema as ace I, so it's a work for forever, for all time. And in this sense, we're dealing. Yes, I think it's not that any current events such as COVID or the war in Ukraine it exactly maps on to the past, but it's more the can we look at certain patterns that we can find running through history? And what I think we're dealing with here is the fact that political societies are in many ways, they can be very complex, they can be larger or they can be smaller, but they work on a number of the same principles. There are the same kind of pressures and um, stresses which cause similar kinds of behavior. So we're thinking within a state, how is that state organized? What are the institutions? How strong are those institutions? How do the institutions divide or concentrate power? And in the same way, we're thinking within a political community, how do individual actors follow their own interests? And we can assume that generally people do want to follow their own interests. They are not entirely rational in doing so. But in the same way, states also are often viewed as, again, following in their own interests, somewhat irrationally. And we can also allow for the fact that states will often accept certain costs of acting against their interests. So, for example, a state will happily go to war on many occasions, even if arguably that's against the interests of that state. So because of all this, it's not surprising that Thucydides has there's a long tradition in international relations, in discussion, scholarship on international relations, of regarding Thucydides as a founder of the realist view of international relations, although one could obviously qualify that somewhat. So in a sense, he can be viewed as being important for providing an important map or set of theories, paradigm for international behavior. And this is important, even if you might argue that actually Thucydides is not, it does not provide a good guide. He's important nonetheless because of his reputation, because of his influence on thinking in other disciplines, in political science and international relations, and indeed he's often adopted as a model by policymakers, and this is perhaps something we can go on to discussing when we get on to the Thucydides trap. So that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. So I guess it depends on the scale. So how detailed is our analysis is. So from what I understand, you would both say that Thucydides is maybe not the best guide to analyze some particular details of, let's say, the current situation or any other situation, but he is a much more powerful and wise guide in more general matters, like the question of human nature or some general patterns. Okay, but yeah, Marek?
Yes, just to briefly respond to you both, I think, of course, I fully agree, but I think we may go even a step further than that. Well, what I would suggest, for the sake of our argument, is that the best way to use Thucydides nowadays is to use him more or less as we use Attic tragedy, or as we probably may use Attic tragedy, rather as a kind of intellectual provocation than a sort of lessons, however deep we may try to go with them. Just to give you one example of something already mentioned by Edmund, it is not just the problem of this or that new branch of science or social science that we will be missing when focusing on Thucydides. It is rather an aspect that is fundamentally missing in Thucydides for us today. For instance, as we and he himself tries to show the mechanisms of the outbreak of war, concentrating, as beautifully said by Edmund in his paper, on, so to say, nature or this or that particular society, and in particular of the Athenians. But the problem is that in our own thinking about great historical upheavals, and especially great political military conflicts, we are torn between two different traditions. One, to put it very, very coarsely, a positivist one, in which everything is based on interest and, say, economic forces, but on the other hand, on a more, say, romantic strand, in which we would rather concentrate on ideologies as a primary, the first mover of big historical upheavals. If they show anything to us, they show that this purely positivist approach just doesn't work. What we are now dealing with and what we are afraid of dealing in future is rather big political powers driven by ideological forces to do something that would probably not be in their best interest. And this aspect is fundamentally missing in Thucydides for many reasons, of course, that would be anachronic to a historical to require this of him, but because when reading, but when reading his mechanisms, we can try to think by distancing ourselves from his analysis of this other missing aspect of our political and historical causation. So to me, as a provocation, that's still a wonderful guide to our time.
That's a very, very interesting perspective, and what I would definitely agree on, but I would maybe expand it beyond what you think, Marek, is that we, in general, we have a very specialized and reductionist science and scholarship nowadays. So that's a that's a phenomenon that we are all familiar with. So we are better and better in understanding fragments and details and studying them. But that's my opinion. I think what we lack is a more holistic, integrative vision. And so I would definitely agree that we need a more well, I would associate a romantic approach, not with I mean the usual deprecating view of romanticism as something, you know, reduced to emotions or things like that, but a way of having a broader vision. So, for instance, what you Edmund said that social sciences are often operating within this paradigm of rationality, so that rational actors act in their best interests on the basis of their, you know, processing of information and things like that. More and more people, and even in social sciences, point out that this is not how our brain works. Emotion matters, relationship matter, community matters, ideology, religion, all of that. So I think it's very important that we remember that those very complex problems and crises cannot be, I think, properly understood only from one perspective. And of course, Thucydides, he offers a perspective, and there are some things which may be missing in that, but yeah, but certainly it's as you said, a good a provocation of sorts to try to think through him about what we are dealing with. Edmund?
Yes, so I think Marek has it exactly right in the sense that this issue of ideology is key. That it isn't very much present in ancient thinking, um, but I actually would argue that this is why ancient theory is actually much more refreshing and has a perspective which is highly valuable when considering the contemporary world. And I take entirely your point, Mateusz, that you know human beings are, in a sense, not entirely rational because they have, as you say, they have ideology, they have emotions which are playing on them. But I think the way in which ancient philosophers and including as Marek said, history is a kind of philosophy contrary to Aristotle. Um, so including historians in this, um, uh, we're focusing on constitutions, so that thinking in Plato's Republic, it is the politeia, is the constitution that affects an individual person's soul, so that the democratic man is the product of democracy, the tyrannical man, the tyrant, is the process of tyranny, is the product of tyranny. And I think that actually, so to answer your objection, Mateusz, I think that the reason why the tyrant in Plato's conception in the Republic, in a sense, acts irrationally. He's maddened by his position as tyrant, is because of that broader constitution. It's because of the way that his irrational behavior is not because he is fundamentally irrational, an irrational being, but of course because the appetitive part of his soul has been stoked to such an extent that it has taken over the rational part of his soul. So in other words, I think that there are, so when we're going back to this question of, what is it? Is it interest, self-interest, or is it emotion or ideology that dictates how states behave to one another, and whether they go to war or not? We have to take into account the fact that certain states, information is transmitted to the policymakers in effective or ineffective ways, and that they understand the negotiating partners in different ways because of their backgrounds, because of the ways in which their political constitutions, which means that they are potentially more or less inclined to be, say, aggressive in their foreign policy, even to the point of declaring war. And we can look at authoritarian regimes are often much more, well, I won't say that they're necessarily more belligerent. It's a complex question, but they're often certainly more distrustful in negotiations than democratic politicians. And again, I think this is not so much a question of, well, it's not just a question of ideology. It's the question of the overall state, the overall constitution. At least that, I think that would be the ancient perspective. And I think, it is perhaps one worth a different perspective, which we can apply to modern discussions. So that, for example, when we're thinking about, why is it that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, should we just be thinking about, was he just driven by ideology? Often we go back to Hitler and say, well, it was just because he was a fascist that he invaded Russia. Well, no, I don't think that's the reason why Putin invaded Ukraine. Again, it's a big question, but it's not just nationalism. It's not just the ideology. It is the fact that Putin is a dictator, again, because he has the overall system of dictatorship encourages, through the flattery of the dictator, through the inability of saying no to a dictator, or giving the dictator information he doesn't want to hear. It encourages overconfidence, and perhaps encourages belligerence, one might argue. So that is why I think, ideology, it's obviously part of the parcel, but I think one might say that the Thucydidean approach should not be ruled out, and in fact provides a very different view, a very different way of analyzing the modern world.
I'd like to return later to that broader view, because you raise a lot of interesting points. But I will, so Marek, I will give you now a time to respond to that. But then I would like to go towards the most popular idea or notion associated with Thucydides, which is Thucydides' trap and the China-US situation. So maybe we can zoom in on something very specific and particular, and then we can move back to those broader issues, which I think are much more important. But you wanted to respond to what Edmund said.
Just very briefly, before we move on, say Greek political theory, even avant la lettre, is of course much more much richer, because if we take Herodotus, to him the democratic man is especially aggressive, And as he says in book 5, Athenians become strong and attack the neighbors because now, once they have gotten rid of their tyrants, they work for themselves, not for the tyrant. And this makes them politically aggressive. Just the brief point.
Okay, thank you. So let's deal with the most obvious, maybe. So the idea of the so-called trap, which of course comes from the first book of Thucydides' history. So and his interpretation of the Peloponnesian War, or the causes of the war, namely, as you probably are all familiar with that. I mean, the claim that that Sparta or Spartans became afraid of the growing power of Athens, and this was the cause of the war. So then, in recent decades, it was sort of translated into this concept of a trap, which has this inevitability to it. I'm not sure if Thucydides meant anything like that, but it's usually used by commentators or analysts that there is a sort of an inevitability almost to a situation when there is an older power, an older hegemon or hegemonic power, and the new one is on the rise, and this leads to war. So that's the idea of the trap. So obviously everyone assumes that the United States is the old power, which would mean it's Sparta, and China is the Athens, so the power on the rise. So both of you were rather critical of this sort of interpretation, but maybe you can flesh out your ideas and understanding of this.
Would you care to start, Edmund?
Yes, certainly. So yes, I should qualify my criticism of the concept, because I think so. This is an idea developed by Graham Allison, initially in an Atlantic article, and then in his full book, which was Destined for War. And the specific details that I would be critical of is, for example, the notion that we can view the Peloponnesian War as precisely this conflict between an established power and a growing power, because in many ways Athens was not necessarily. You can't view it as a new power, because even in the 6th century, so a century before the Peloponnesian War, someone like Herodotus could regard Athens and Sparta as both being the greatest of the Hellenic cities. And in many ways, the power of Athens had arguably declined in 431, when the main Peloponnesian War started, from what it had been in, say, the 460s. But these are points of detail. What I would say is that I think the overall conception of the Thucydides trap is worth serious consideration. Now, it's often dismissed and by this notion that Allison was arguing that war is inevitable between these emerging powers and established powers, which is not actually what Allison said. So I'll just quote the point that Allison makes is in the book: when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, the resulting structural stress makes a violent clash the rule, not the exception. So he's not saying that war is inevitable. He's just saying that it is quite common in the examples that he outlines. And again, to emphasize, the reason why it's common is because of that structural stress. So it is the tension that builds between these powers. Now, it's been quite common to dismiss Alison's views in this kind of using this kind of straw man argument of inevitability. And there's actually been a very recent. So this shows you how common how influential Alison's book has been, even while at the same time it's often dismissed in a kind of offhand manner. So an example of why this is the case is James Cleverly's recent 2023 Mansion House speech when he was Foreign Secretary. And he argues in that speech, nor do I see anything inevitable, so I quote, nor do I see anything inevitable about conflict between China and the United States and the wider West. We are not compelled to be prisoners of what Graham Allison called the Thucydides trap, whereby a rising power follows the trajectory of ancient Athens and collides head-on with an established power. Well, we may not be compelled, and yes, there isn't anything inevitable about conflict between China and the United States, but that's not actually the point. The point is that these pressures caused by huge change in the balance of power, caused by the massive growth of the Chinese economy, is causing structural stress, which we can see in all kinds of areas, such as, for example, potential conflict over Taiwan. The very fact that now China has overtaken Taiwan economically and militarily means that there is a real threat there. Now, James Cleverly was actually echoing, or perhaps unintentionally, I don't know, a speech that Xi Jinping, or comment that Xi Jinping made in a speech in September of 2015, where he said again, very similarly, and he was making this speech in Seattle on a visit to the United States. He said, we should strictly base our judgment on facts, lest we become victims to hearsay, paranoia, or self-imposed bias. There is no such thing as the Thucydides trap in the world. So again, he completely dismisses the idea. And the notion is, well, we don't want war, we don't want conflict, it's not inevitable, so we can just ignore it, which again I think is something of a straw man argument. And the other criticism I made of the Thucydides trap is that Allison, coming very much from this sort of realist international relations background, completely misses the importance of constitutions. Well, he doesn't completely. He discusses serious differences in outlook between the American outlook and the Chinese outlook, but he doesn't really grapple in detail with how a particular constitution, the particular constitution of states, may affect the outcome of whether war happens or not between these established and rising states. And a good example of one of the examples he cites of when war does not happen between such a rising or established state was between Britain and America during the 19th and first half of the 20th century, which of course was not the case between Britain and Germany before the First World War, which had a rather different result. Why was this? Well, one possible reason is that both Britain and America were democracies. in this period, or something approaching democracy, given that Britain in the 19th century did not have full male or indeed any female suffrage. But I think we can effectively say they were both democracies. And it might be argued, people like, again, Natan Sharansky in his book, The Case for Democracy, has argued that democracies, while democracies do declare war quite frequently, they very rarely declare war against each other. So that was, so again, I'm not saying that I didn't want to, I think the Thucydides trap is an excellent example of where the concepts developed in Thucydides can and have been applied and can have great influence on thinking in foreign policy, even when, as you've seen in those examples, policymakers try desperately to shoot down some of these ideas. But there, I'd better stop. Thank you.
Let me concentrate on the other side of what Edmund just said. So not on the application, justified or unjustified, of this particular reading of Thucydides that was suggested, but by our possible applications of it. And so less about Thucydides' trap in our debates, political, even diplomatic clashes of our days, but trying to think about the world we live in using this Thucydidean idea. And I think that from this point of view, of course, Thucydides is paramountly important and useful. If you think of this main component of Sparta's decision to go to war as Sparta's fear of Athens, then we are back to this very point from which we started. If we take fear as being perhaps, and I'm saying this as a former subject of an authoritarian regime, so someone who lived with its propaganda daily for, well, when I was very young, but still, then fear is perhaps the most important element of everyday ideology, because what your propaganda would try to instill, as you said, Edmund, in this, say, authoritarian man based on the constitution we live in, or we lived in, is exactly the fact that we should fear the outside world because they want to destroy us one way or another. And then you can channel this, this strand of your propaganda against a particular enemy and declare war. So this is exactly, I think, what we are living today. As you mentioned, Vladimir Putin, he expressly says this. One of the reasons of the invasion of Ukraine in his propaganda, but I'm fully persuaded that he just thinks in these terms, was the idea that the NATO, so to say, or actually, if we leave aside the actual say, political or military entities, the Western world will come closer to his doorsteps, too close, not to be dangerous for his own authoritarian, not regime, but state. And this fear is exactly what I think was the driving power behind his decision. And what we fear now, although it is a different kind of fear, is that other authoritarian regimes in the world would apply the same. So the fear, and it is not propaganda, it is not just propaganda, it is a part of ideology. So in this way, actually, although we are very far from our constellations of power, our model of state, and so on. This insight, if we take it literally and seriously from Thucydides, I think, unfortunately, is deeply, deeply right, is paramountly important to understand, to grasp what is going on now. I will stop here because this is probably the point we can discuss further.
Okay, I can see someone raising your hand, but I will leave some time for questions and comments at the end. So please be patient. Now, I want to follow up on what you have just said, because it's also something you suggested, Marek, in your piece in Antigone, and which maybe we could call a Thucydides's trap in reverse, and I mean the lack of fear. So what I think what has been somehow propagated throughout the Western world, maybe that's just a perspective of Central Eastern post-Soviet Europe, was the opposite of fear. There's nothing to fear. There will be no more war. After the Cold War, all conflict is ended. The good side has won. So I think if it's interesting to compare this a very important factor. I would agree, the fear on the part of Russia and maybe other autocratic states today, fear that leads to war. But on the other hand, you mentioned, Marek, that we know at least one historical example, which is of course 1930s, where there was a fear of war, and I mean the reluctance of the Western powers to intervene earlier against Germany. There was, of course, generalized fear of war after the World War I, but there was also, we could say, not enough fear. So if we can easily say, if we knew how bad things would be, we would have made different decisions. So you raise a point about the present moment. Are we afraid enough of Russia, for instance, or China? The question is, should we go to war in order to prevent greater calamities to come or not? And if we are not afraid enough, we are sort of living in we are trying to convince ourselves the situation is not so terrifying. It also is maybe a kind of a trap, because you can see in Europe, of course, a very different attitude in those countries which have a border with the Russian Federation and those who don't. Maybe that's just my opinion, but that's very clear. The attitude and social attitude and even the attitude of politicians is completely different. So I think fear and the lack of fear may be also interesting factor here. I don't know what you think about this.
I will briefly respond because I've written another piece, this time not in Antigone, exactly about this. And to be very briefly, when we review big wars that escalated into world wars or did not escalate, like, say, the Crimean War, then I think we may hesitantly generalize that big wars escalate or actually become political facts when one of the sides of the conflict is not fully aware of its nature, and so not fully aware of the measures, this or that, I mean, radical or not, that may be necessary to stop the escalation. The World War II is just one example, but there are other examples of such conflicts that the clashes which involved a side which was not only did not react timely, but was not exactly aware of the nature of the conflict and of its proportions. So interpreted this conflict usually as a local problem that can be stopped, like in 1939, one way or another, thus giving, and I'm of course now alluding to Edmund's ideas, thus giving this tyrannical leader and tyrannical man or autocratic and so on, time to consolidate and move on. I know it sounds simplistic, but actually, when we think of the Crimean War, the direct clash that led to direct realization of the nature of the conflict was much easier to stop, despite the fact that all world powers, almost, except for the United States, were already involved to stop the further escalation. And other examples of it, including the Cold War, actually. So I will stop here.
Yes, just a quick note on fear. I think this is a very important point which we should have brought in earlier. So thank you, Marek, for bringing it up. And I think you're entirely right. I think there are lots of interesting things which we could get into, and lots of interesting questions about. Firstly, so what kind of fear are we dealing with? So Marek mentioned the notion of a tyrannical society being sort of seeped in fear. Everything is governed by fear. Basically, everything is governed by the will to survive. And this is the view of the tyrant, and this is the view of everyone under the tyrant. All of the courtiers, all of the subjects are trying to survive, and that because of that fear, truth doesn't actually matter that much. What you have to do, this is why Aristotle and Plato and etc. believe that flatterers were always surrounding the tyrant. Everyone, what you need to say is not what is true, but what the tyrant wants to hear. So fear affects that kind of society. But when one is thinking about a democracy, one might think, well, what is the fear? The fear might be, in the case of Athens, as the tyrannos polis, the fear of losing control over the allies, as Thucydides presents it, or the orators in Thucydides' work. But one might also wonder, well, who is it who is making the decisions to go to war? And in a democracy, as it is made clear in Euripides's Suppliants, the Theban herald can say, well, if everyone could see themselves dying in a war, no polis would go to war. But on the other hand, in a state like such as Sparta, decisions on war are made by a much narrower body, and I hesitate to mention Sparta while Paul Cartledge and Stephen Hodgkinson are in the room, but we might talk about that kind of consideration. So yes, I think it's an absolutely important topic, and perhaps one could have a separate discussion entirely.
But I find it interesting that that fear comes to the fore. Of course, Thucydides mentions fear as the cause of war, but in the spirit of this broader view of politics, so not just structural tensions, not just rational decisions, but also if we take into consideration emotions, I think it's interesting that we are speaking of fear and not of eros. Plato suggests that the tyrant is not primarily driven by fear, but by a perverted eros, so a perverted love for something. I realize that we very rarely talk about or even think about what are the desires of, say, Putin or Xi Jinping or the authorities governing Iran, and so on. But clearly, I would guess it has something to do with our culture. There has been a lot of studies on the growing in the Western societies in general. People are more afraid of everything, despite the relative stability of life in recent decades. So maybe that's why we tend to think that people are aggressive because they are afraid. But ancient authors would, of course, say that yes, maybe in many cases, yes, that's so. But people are aggressive, and states are aggressive also because they want various things. Just they want money, they want power, they want pleasure, and they want prestige, and so on. So I think there are a lot of examples in Thucydides of that as well.
And I think just to pop in there, hubris is an interesting point, because as Aristotle says, it is something which is violence that gives pleasure to the doer, because it is something, it's not just mere arrogance, it is making someone else feel that that person is inferior to you, which gives the doer, the perpetrator, pleasure. And I think you're right that, pleasure and desire are, and we should also mention hatred. I think an awful lot, we again, this is, all mixes into the calculus of rationality, of acting in your interests. I think in many cases it is sometimes in the interests, it can be viewed as being in the interests of someone to act totally out of hatred and pleasure at making someone feel subordinate and worthless. And I think this underlies a lot of the humanitarian rights abuses and terrible acts that we see in places like Bucha and in Ukraine.
If I may, I think, although I totally agree with you and Edmund, I think we are veering towards Herodotus here, because actually the idea that the great wars, of course, I simplify, I'm sorry for that, are due to first vengeance, and secondly, pleonexia. So let us say we're in the same room with Eros. So the greed to possess more, and possibly more than we should be given by the gods, but that's another level and probably overestimated in Herodotean scholarship. Now, why we do not see this and why we do not discuss this nowadays, as Mateusz asked, I would say this is quite simple. We do not say this, we do not discuss this for a very simple reason, that we live in a modern ideological construct of the state and its propaganda. So the authoritarian regimes would never actually say that they want more than they have. They will not say that they are imperialist, because imperialists are bad. So what we would discuss is rather what they explicitly say, the fear, and not what would, say, a tyrannical man or a great ruler of a global empire in antiquity say, I want more. Or I'm going to war because I need to avenge my country's the former debacle or whatever. So we live in this ideological propagandist modern construct in which the actual intentions of an authoritarian regime or a tyrant are never stated explicitly. So we rarely discuss them. But as you both say, there is a lot to discuss.
Yeah, but it brings us to another topic, which is morality as a possible dimension of politics and of Thucydides. I mean, obviously Thucydides is not a moralizing author, and there is a difference between him and Herodotus and many other ancient historians. But I think I'm not a specialist in Thucydides, but I've always felt that there is a fundamental moral dimension to his thinking, even though it's maybe more implicit than explicit. But again, today it's often we can often hear from commentators and analysts that politics is all about power, all about structure, and only naive people want to bring morality into politics. So that's a very interesting perspective for me. Why should we all buy into that? Why should we all agree that morality is a question of individuals or maybe political communities within, but not a thing between the states? That's an assumption. That's not something we can prove or disprove. But does Thucydides tell us anything important or interesting about the role that morality play in politics, in international relations? Because of course, Marek, you wrote about the Melian dialogue in your piece, but also said that it needs to be put in a context of other passages from Thucydides, because the Melian dialogue is usually read as just this, so a kind of Nietzschean concept of international politics. So and Athenians are just honest. They are not trying to be hypocritical, as you said, all the tyrannical regimes are. The Athenians are just saying openly, we want to conquer you, and that's the way it is. No, it requires no further explanation. But is it really the framework of Thucydides that it's just about power, who is stronger, and nothing else counts? Yeah, Marek, I asked you directly.
Oh, yeah.
You wrote about
sorry.
Edmund, of course.
Sorry. Well,
as well.
Well, my first answer would be a bit tricky. Yes and no. Well, the very fact that we read Melian dialogue, which is of course a literary construct, and perhaps a much more, much deeper literary thought construct than other, say, speeches, or this is a dialogue, not a speech, in Thucydides, and he explicitly lets us see that there are no actual people in this dialogue. There are no actual politicians on either side. These are generalized ideas of both sides. So when he does it, I think he wants us to think among the moral lines as well. Exactly when he slightly ironically, I think also, or sarcastically, constructs his parallel episode in the Plataean non-dialogue, when the Plataeans are put to death by the Spartan commanders, after having been asked a tricky question. Did you do or not anything good for the Spartans? I'm simplifying. So yes, he certainly wants us to see some episodes of the war through moral lenses. And as you mentioned, Edmund Bucha and other places in Ukraine, this is exactly what he would probably do when writing about our current wars. But on a more general level, I do not think that Thucydides wants to give us a truly moral lesson beyond our simple, well, compassion when we digest this or that particular episode of the war that would be actually inhuman not to react to in a moral way. I think it is less, in general, it is less about morality and more about culture. Maybe I will not go as far as Edmund went, and I would not use the term constitution, but what we see beyond Thucydides' overall construct, and there is a beautiful paper about that, unfortunately in Polish, from the 60s by my teacher Benedetto Bravo, is a kind of cultural construct with its representative, although failed politically, Pericles. And in this cultural construct, assembly that can do stupid things and make stupid decisions, but at times may show compassion or try to mitigate its own power. The democratic assembly in Athens is rather a cultural concept than a moral one. It's rather a cultural attitude, a general cultural attitude towards the world, and not just our need or our ambition to be moral. In a way, it's much less than being moral, but in the world of international politics, I'd say it's a lot. So I will stop here.
Thank you. It's a very interesting point about morality, and I think it comes to the core of what we've been discussing in both in tonight and in previous lectures we've had here. So I think Thucydides is obviously presented as very much a realist, not concerned with morality. But in fact, he is. He's often dealing with very immoral actions and a way of thinking, as is shown in the Melian dialogue and also in speeches by Cleon and other speakers. He's presenting precisely an immoral or amoral view of the world, which has motivated a lot of the enormities that took place during the Peloponnesian War. But I think when we're listening to what Thucydides says in his own voice, thinking, for example, of his account of the plague at Athens, where he suggests that all moral standards just fell away because of this despair that the gods or human medicine could not help people, or when in his description of the revolution in Corcyra and other revolutions during the course of the Peloponnesian War, I think he speaks in very strong moral terms, that these are people committing crimes, and they're doing so simply in order to benefit a particular party, so to benefit themselves politically. There's no end to the kinds of crimes that they will commit, which I think is a very strong moral denunciation of this kind of behavior. And I think we've sort of come to the crux of it. And again, I'm generalizing here, but I think that there is potentially a difference between ancient thinking and modern thinking, particularly what one might call liberal thinking in the Western world, that thinks of human beings very positively as being morally good. But I think in the ancient world, we have a concept of thinking of human beings as usually morally bad, and I think there are two things that keep human beings in line, and that is fear of the gods and religion, and the other is fear of the law. And where the law is strong, you will be able to have keep the bad nature of Plato in the Laws, for example, says that human nature, physis being what it is, if we do not have the law ruling, then we will have a situation where an individual will rule just according to his own desires, according to his own wishes. And I think, again, when we're thinking of in terms of, if the Greeks thought of the best possible outcome for relations between states, it would be that no state should be able to do what it wants. And Demosthenes, again, looking forward to the 4th century, is saying, the Macedonians want to do exactly what you wanted to do in the 5th century. The Athenians wanted to do what the Spartans wanted to do, what the Thebans wanted to do. They want to do what they want. And it's a constant effort to prevent people from doing what they want. And what they want means treating people however they want, which means treating people badly. So I think in that sense, there is a way of reconciling the kind of realist view of Thucydides with the moral view, that in fact it is only, but we can only get if you like, a realistic assessment of how we can have a moral approach to relationships within states once we accept what human nature is. Yes, I would say definitely there is very much a moral side to Thucydides.
Yeah, and then we can bridge that to what you, Marek, wrote in your piece, namely that Thucydides seems to suggest that Athens can exercise self-correction and self-refrainment, possibly to a greater degree than Sparta, and that brings us to the topic I would like to discuss as the last topic today before we open the floor for questions. And you, both of you, mentioned this a couple of times today and in your articles, namely the constitutions and the evaluation of constitutions, and also moral evaluations of various constitutions. So I think one of the biggest differences between our culture and our perspective and the perspective of Thucydides and other ancient authors is that for us in the West, democracy is the best constitution, or the least worst, as Churchill said. In any case, we've made this moral judgment that democracy is better than autocracy or oligarchy or whatever. But in antiquity, it was a debate. Of course, Plato didn't believe that democracy was the best constitution, and the majority of ancient authors would rather go into the direction of some mixed constitution than purely democratic one. But what Thucydides, according to you, has to say about the value of democracy versus tyranny? Is it that democracy is less belligerent or more belligerent, or at the same level with autocracy or tyranny? And how can we apply this to our situation today?
Should I start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Again, I think that the problem is which side of the question we would like to tackle. What we would say when analyzing Thucydides as an ancient historian in his context, so what his historically speaking thoughts might have been on the matter, or what we would like to do with him today, and taking him as a guide for our thinking about our modern world. And these are, as we discussed it from the very beginning, two different things. The first aspect, I think, is less about Thucydides. It's less about democracy as such. It is about Athenian culture, so to say. And there is a lot in his praise of democracy ascribed to Pericles, despite the fact that it's then, of course, undermined by the description of plague as Cornford has seen long time ago, and then of course everyone repeats this, and rightly so. But there is a lot about his view of Athens as being special in a way, not just as a democracy, although it is a basis for this exceptionality, but about its culture, about its rhetoric culture as well. And that is why the self-correcting, say, mechanism that we can see in action in the Mytilenean debates, famously, to just mention one thing. So this would be, I think, rather about Athens and its culture than democracy as such. Now, when we move to our democracies, so first thing and of course it is an obvious thing, is to say that the negative valorization of democracy as, say, weak or unstable is not only ancient, you can find it as a very important strand of political thinking in the Western world, not only in the 30s, responding to authoritarian regimes at rise, but also in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century, when responding to the internal threats, such as a wave of radical and of terrorism. There is a lot of debate. There were many debates at the time about the weaknesses of democracy as being vulnerable to the internal threat or to the external threat, and so it is now. So what I think we may try to say with Thucydides about democracy as being better is not so much its moral dimension, but its practical dimension, because of being self-critical, and I'm of course simplifying a lot, as more, say, as able to correct its weaknesses, its failures, and so to, in the long run, to keep our world safer than those regimes who are, no doubt, in this or that particular historical moment, may be more efficient, more powerful, more brazen, and so will win because of being more aggressive. But still, in this human and cultural constellation that I think was one of the goals of Thucydides, in this wider outlook, democracy would be just more efficient in keeping the world better, also in the world of international politics, even without the moral dimension as its, say, obligatorily guiding idea. Because, of course, again, in propaganda, we will find it, but many, I think, there will be a number of people and states in the world that will not buy into the idea that democratic states are more moral because they do this or that, which is immoral. They do. So I would rather think of international efficiency in the long run to keep the world safer than looking for a moral dimension of democracy as such.
Edmund?
Yes, I mean, it's a big debate, what can we demonstrate empirically or otherwise that whether democracy is the best form of government. And I think in many ways, again, looking at it from an ancient perspective, this whole debate misses the point. I mean, apart from anything else, we are all fortunately, I think, citizens in democracies. So we kind of often want to see that democracies are the best forms of government. But from the ancient perspective, even though this is an ancient Greek word, democracy, it's not democracy that democracy isn't the sort of magic formula that gives good government. Democracies can be have good governance associated with them. But I think from an ancient perspective, we're really looking at a couple of other things. The first one is the one I already mentioned, the rule of law. Are the laws paramount, and do they constrain the magistrates? And this could be said to be the case in Athens. It could be said to be the case in Sparta, which was a non-democracy. You could call it a monarchy, an oligarchy, probably most accurately an oligarchy, and in other states. I think the other aspect that is often not mentioned in our modern debate is education. And this, of course, was viewed as being absolutely key by people such as Plato. And I think we're needing to think again of the general sort of culture. It's very difficult to tie down exactly what we're thinking of here, but it's a general sort of culture of freedom, of liberty, that creates positive forms of behavior, of patriotism, and so on and so forth. Do these exist? And I think in both cases, both the health of the institutions, the rule of law, and this more sort of amorphous notion of education and culture, we've got another factor which is institutions can decline. Culture can dissipate, populations change. So, if you look at a country such as Britain, in the 19th, 20th century, we've got sort of very strong culture of liberty from the sort of Whig history of Britain, going back to the Great Reform Act and other important moments. I mean, this is not the kind of thing which is foremost in thinking in this country in the present day. So that kind of culture, that kind of education can dissipate. And I think democracies can decline. I think all constitutions can decline. And can go through and can suffer from stresses. This is a machine which can go through a lot of problems and get into a lot of difficulties. And this was certainly the case with the Spartan constitution, for example, that this was an excellent constitution which served its purpose for an awfully long time. But in the end, we have a series of coups, the murder of a king, Aegeus IV, and then a coup by Cleomenes, and it goes into a whole series of coups, and the constitution falls apart. So anyway, very briefly, the point is, yes, I think democracy probably, as Churchill roughly said, is the best constitution, bar all the others. But we've got some caveats there as well. So some democracies can function better than others, and some non-democracies can also function reasonably well as well.
I think the point that Marek made about culture is very good. So we tend to think of democracy as a procedure, let's say, or as a form of government, while of course every form of government and every procedure exists in a context, in a cultural context, and a moral context and religious context, of course, and so I think it's very interesting to and it's necessary to remember that it's not just democracy. It's a kind of a slogan, of course, nowadays. It's not just democracy we defend. It's a kind of culture, maybe not a monolithic culture, but and some people, of course, reject that, but a kind of culture which we used to call the Western culture that we defend, and it can be traced back to antiquity. I hope still we can think in those terms, and Thucydides is of course a crucial part of this tradition and this culture, and I think this discussion shows how much inspiration we can draw from Thucydides, in a way, thinking with him and about him and through him about various things in a very fruitful way. Okay, so now I would like to. I know it's been almost an hour and a half, but if you have any questions, I'm addressing the audience right now. If you have any questions or comments, please do, and you could just unmute yourself and speak, or you can raise your hand. Malcolm Lowe, if you can unmute yourself and turn on your camera, maybe.
Yes, yes, I've done that. Well, I have 2 points. First of all, Thucydides goes to great efforts to determine how political decisions are made, the process. He analyzes the process and that leads up to decisions. And that is maybe something we can learn from today. And I even wrote something like this in the chat, which I can read out. One of the central issues tackled by Thucydides was to analyze how the Athenian assembly, in its deliberations over foreign policy, made fatally mistaken decisions, in particular with respect to the Sicilian expedition. So are there lessons to be learned in respect of contemporary international problems? Does human nature and behavior seem to have remained unchanged in this respect? And can we see similar cases of mistaken decision-making that resulted from comparable behavior by politicians today? Say, in the current frustrating drama of the US Congress. So that's one point. The second point is shorter. There's a crucial difference between the Athenian democracy and what we call democracies today. In the Athenian democracy, the whole people gathered together could determine policy. What are usually called democracies today are ones in which the people doesn't determine policy, it chooses who determines policy on its behalf. And the only exception is maybe Switzerland, where the availability of referenda is so, I mean, there's the possibility of referenda is so available that the decision makers already take into account in their decisions the possibility that popular opinion will overturn them. So there are 2 points: decision-making on the one hand, and the difference between Athenian democracy and what we call democracy today.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to respond, Marek, Edmund?
Maybe I will just briefly comment on the second issue, on the difference between our democracies and the Athenian democracy. I think that from this point of view, the set of problems we are discussing are even more and not less to the point, because against Euripides, as quoted by Edmund at the very beginning of our discussion, well, when everyone votes to go to war, and everyone actually will go to war among those who vote, or may at least think he will go to war eventually, then we may think of human decisions as being more rational in the banal sense of the term. Whereas what we see in Thucydides is that people, even if they actually have their lives at stake directly when they vote for war and other important issues, they do it nevertheless. So the mechanisms we are trying to observe would actually not be that different, despite this fundamental difference between the two models of democracy. So I would just add this as a comment to your excellent points.
Yes, I agree entirely. I mean, I think, again, decision making in these, how polity makes decisions is obviously always going to be determined by a number of factors. It's going to be determined by the means by which a society makes those decisions, but also by the question that is posed, by the particular alliances that are present within any deliberative body. Yeah, I think in that sense there are obviously, as I stated at the start, that there are obviously parallels. It's unfortunate that when you look through history at occasions when people make very bad decisions, it's not because they don't know that these are in some ways bad decisions, but because a series of a chain of events, and because of the circumstances in which they are placed. I mean, you think of sort of people like the start of the First World War. Why did this happen, even though everyone thought it was a bad idea, apart from perhaps the German High Command? It's not because we don't think this is a bad idea. It's because this is what we have to do. And I think this was also probably the case in Athens and Sparta as well. We've got to a point, and I think Thucydides kind of makes the one of the things that comes up very much in Thucydides and Xenophon's histories is the complexity of truces running out, for example. Do we go to war? We've only got the odd way in which the Greeks had decided to have truces. We've only got a few years left on our truce. We signed a truce for 30 years or 5 years or 10 years. Do we go to war at the end of that stage, or can we make an alliance? If we can't make an alliance, we better make a truce with these people. That's the kind of deliberation we're making in a democratic state. So it is very constrained, and I think that's also the case in a modern democracy as well.
Any other questions or comments or thoughts? I was just thinking that the idea that keeps coming back is this necessity, in the sense that for some reason we like to think of war as something that not that we want war, but war is something which we are forced into by many factors. And of course, from a moral point of view, I mean, the traditional Western moral point of view, that's of course justifiable. We morally judge war to be a bad thing. So we wonder how did we get into this? Of course, we were forced, we were pressured, we couldn't find any better solution. Yeah, but the other side of this is that that there is in human nature, from a more pessimistic point of view, there is this eros for war, and it's a scary thought, perhaps, to think that some people, maybe many people, want war because they make money on it, they gain power and prestige and pleasure and all sorts of things from war. So I think it's the interplay of those two ideas to a certain extent. Yeah.
Just a brief comment on our general discussion to replace it in the intellectual and, well, maybe even moral context of our time. So we are discussing Thucydides as Thucydides and as a possible guide or not to our current world events. But it is good to know that we are not alone, and broader projects of the kind. For instance, at the University of Tübingen in Germany, there is this project Cassandra, probably you've heard about, that stifles through the entire world literature of our time to look for cracks and stresses and problems that may one day escalate in many parts of the world into full-blown crisis. As far as I know, it is being used by the German government, both in diplomacy and in military calculations, whatever they make of it. But it's a huge project of dealing with contemporary literature from the point of view of the way we may learn, treating as a kind of barometer of our conceivable problems in future, which is scary but optimistic for the, say, as we think of the of our believing in the strength of literature and culture, but still scary. So Thucydides is one piece of a bigger picture, puzzle perhaps, we live in, actually, intellectually. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we are going to wrap up. I'm very glad that we could have this conversation, and that we could come back to Thucydides as a source of wisdom in a more complex way. So not just in the sense that there are some answers in Thucydides or some tricks we can use, but the spirit of the ongoing discussion and debate and conversation and dialogue, which I think the culture, the Athenian culture clearly possessed, and I hope we can rekindle that spirit in our times, and thanks to such conversations, I think so. So I'm very grateful that you agreed to talk about Thucydides and other things in our present situation and crisis today. Okay, so once again, thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Edmund, for the discussion. Thanks a lot.
And Edmund Stewart, Professor Edmund Stewart from the University of Nottingham, for our guest today, and thank you very much. I thank the audience, of course, for showing up
so much. And
thanks.
thank you.
Great to meet you, Marek.
Goodbye.
Bye.